Hi home bakers! Today I'm in the kitchen making baguettes with Poolish.
Using a preferment gives these baguettes that amazing French boulangerie flavor. This recipe is easy to make. All you need is a few simple ingredients and some patience.
This delicious French bread has a golden crust, chewy texture, and rich flavor. The overnight fermentation of the Poolish adds complexity and a light open crumb you just can't get from quick rise doughs. This easy recipe is going to give you bakery results right at home.
So let's get into the kitchen. This is how I make a French baguette with Poolish.
The first thing I need to do for this recipe is make the Poolish. I'm starting this recipe the night before I want to make my baguettes. Get a sealable container that will allow the Poolish to rise 3 times in size. In the container, I'm going to stir together 3/4 of a cup of warm water and 1/8 of a teaspoon of dry active yeast. Then with a spoon, I'm going to stir in a 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour until I have a thick dough. Make sure to get all the way to the corners of the container so there's no spots of flour left. Now I'm going to seal the container and set it aside to rise at room temperature for 8 to 12 hours. Similar to the process of making sourdough, Poolish is a type of pre-ferment used in bread baking that helps develop flavor, texture, and aroma in baked bread. Now it's the next day and my Poolish has risen and is very active and bubbly on the inside. Similar to how you would use a bubbly active sourdough starter to bake bread. Now in the bowl of a stand mixer or in a large bowl if you're making the recipe by hand, mix in 3/4 of a cup of warm water and another 1/8 of a teaspoon of dry active yeast. Add in the risen and bubbly Poolish. Then I'm going to mix in 2¼ cups of all-purpose flour. Knead this together for 4 minutes if you're using a machine or 6 minutes if you're making this recipe by hand. Then I'm going to cover and allow it to rest for 20 minutes. This process is called an autolyse. Now that my dough has rested, I'm going to sprinkle on top 1 teaspoon of salt and knead it into the dough for another 3 minutes or until the dough is smooth and glossy. Cover and allow it to rise in a warm spot for 30 minutes. This is going to allow the gluten in the dough to relax. Now, with wet hands to prevent sticking, grab the side of the dough and stretch it upwards. Fold it over to the other side of the dough. Turn the bowl and do the same thing with the opposite side. Then turn and do a stretch and fold on the other 2 corners of the dough. Cover and allow the dough to rest another 30 minutes. After this, I'm going to repeat the same 4 stretch and folds one more time. And by now you should notice the dough starting to develop lots of different sized bubbles. Cover and allow it to rest another 45 minutes. Now that my dough has rested and is nicely puffed up, I'm going to tip it out onto a floured work surface and carefully split it in half. Try to keep as many bubbles on the inside as possible. Gently fold the dough over onto itself and pinch the seams closed. You can wet your hands as needed to prevent sticking. Gently press and roll each half of the dough into a long, thin baguette shape. The dough should be quite soft and easy to shape. Now baguettes are typically made with something called a couche, and some bakers even use specifically designed baguette pans. A couche is a soft cloth that's used to separate the bread loaves while they're rising. And baguette pans are normally perforated for airflow and are that same cylindrical shape. If you don't have either of these at home, another great option is to use parchment paper. Cut a long piece of parchment paper slightly longer than the dough. Fold the paper in thirds lengthwise for structure. Then dust the parchment paper with flour and place the dough in the middle. Tie each end with kitchen twine to form the parchment paper around the dough into a half cylinder shape. Dust the top of the dough with flour and allow it to rise in a warm spot for about 45 minutes or until it's doubled. Right before going into the oven, I'm going to score the top of the loaves with a sharp blade right down the center. Place an oven-proof dish with a few ice cubes in the bottom of the oven to create steam. Then place the little parchment packages of dough onto a baking sheet and bake in a preheated 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 degrees Celsius oven, fan on, forced air, or convection mode. I'm going to bake the loaves for 8 minutes. Then remove from the oven and carefully untie the ends of the parchment paper, fold down the sides for an even colored crust on top. Return the loaves to the oven and bake for another 6 to 8 minutes or until deeply golden and sounds hollow when tapped. Remove the loaves from the paper and serve warm. These French baguettes are everything you love about artisan bread. Crisp and chewy on the outside with a soft and tender inside.
And as always, you can find a link to the full written recipe in the description box below.
Enjoy! If you're a fan of deliciously simple vintage recipes and old-fashioned skills, then you'll want to check out this next video. Thanks for stopping by.